All right, it looks like those attendees jumping to have slowed down just a little bit, so we will go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining today for a Learning and Growing webinar, Flipped Classrooms Applied. Today, our presenter is Dr. Kimberly Barker of Johns Hopkins University, the Citadel Central Carolina Community College in North Carolina, and the Technical College of the Lowcountry in South Carolina. And my name is Sydney Smith, and I'm the Educational Courseware Representative here at Hawks Learning. Today we are going to have a really interactive presentation, so please utilize that chat that you have down there at the bottom of the screen, as well as the Q&A that we have down there as well. We will be having a live Q&A session throughout the presentation and then after as well, so please be sure to enter in any questions or comments as we go. And with that being said, I will go ahead and hand it over to our presenter.
Hi, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Hawks, for having me present again. I always look forward to these webinars together. I will go ahead and give a couple disclaimers at the beginning. And the first is I was intending to present this as a meeting format. So we would have breakout sessions and we would have chatting. And that seems to have changed a little bit. So we're going to fly by the seat of our pants a tad. And you will see on the screen the PowerPoint that I've kind of put together to help guide us. When I turn on the PowerPoint, I may not be able to see the screen at all. And so we're gonna have a little help moderating the questions in the chat at the bottom. So we're gonna start at the beginning, because that's typically the best place to start. And we'll see if I can get this to work. And if I can't, I apologize in advance. There we go. We're gonna start at the beginning here. And I also want to apologize if you hear whining off to the side. That would be my dog, my rescue dog, who is sunbathing right now and does not like hearing other voices in the house. He's not used to it. Okay, so first of all, we're gonna revert a little bit back to the original presentation for flipped classrooms. And that's because I'm not sure how many people who are here today have joined us for some of the previous conversations. And I want to make sure we're kind of all at the same place before we engage in some of the more specific aspects of teaching in a flipped classroom. So as we said, my name's Kim Barker, and I, until very recently, I taught full-time for Central Carolina Community College in North Carolina. And I recently ran away from the state and moved to South Carolina, where I teach now as an adjunct for the 4 colleges that were mentioned. And one of the reasons I wanted us to mention each of the colleges specifically is because you can probably tell from their names, they're radically different. And I offer this information simply to say the content that I'm going to share here and that we're going to talk about today and try to develop can be applied across all domains. You can use this in junior high, high school, higher education, and multiple levels of higher education. And I do use this and have used this throughout. So we're going to start the way I start every class with, which is with a role question. And your first question, I'm going to ask if we can share on the screen. And there you go. So the question is, thank you. Which way does the toilet paper roll go? Over or under? And immediately everybody said over. I'm going to wait for this to populate a little bit. Interesting. Okay, so it looks like we've slowed down as far as responses go, and we've got a majority saying over and a minority saying under. Now, the second part of the question, and I talk with each of my classes through the questions and what's required and what you can say and what you can't say, and we'll talk about that again a little more in just a moment. But the second part of the question is why. So I need you to utilize your chat function and answer why you think it goes over or why you think it goes under, what your reasoning might be. And if someone can help share the chat with me so that we can discuss some of these answers. Why do you think it would need to go over, or why do you think it would need to go under? We getting any answers here?
We are not yet. Okay, we do. We have a few. So one person said easier to use. Another says easier to pull and tear when it is over, I suppose. Another person said not choosy, can go with either for my household. I wasn't allowed to vote, but I will say over because that is always how my mom did it. And so that was how I was taught. Another person said over, it doesn't get hung up. Of course, if I had cats, I'd probably say under.
That's always what I point out. Okay, anything else in there?
I think that is it.
Okay, so I start with this role question for every class I teach, everywhere, at any time. And the reason is because it's something everyone can relate to. Everyone knows what we're talking about when we're talking about the toilet paper roll. And so students immediately learn that they're allowed to have their opinions, and they're allowed to share their opinions, and we're going to be kind about everybody's opinions, and we're modeling certain behaviors, but also because these courses that I teach are taught in a science-based format. You need to be able to substantiate your opinions. Why do you think this? What is your reasoning behind this? I had one student one time, while we were having the roll question, got online and looked up the patent for the toilet paper roll, and it is indeed over. So the majority should be excited to hear this. I then asked students, if they don't have a preference or don't naturally jump into the conversation, do you have cats? What would happen if you have cats? I had a student last night in a brand new class with Johns Hopkins that said it goes over so that it's not so that it is less bacteria ridden being against the wall. And I thought, well, that's not anything I've ever thought about before, but that will now be in the forefront of my mind. Okay, can we do roll question number 2 really quickly?
Yes, let me pull up the second question. All right.
Good. So the second question is, where do you squeeze your toothpaste? From the top, the middle, or the bottom? Think that's a good stopping point? Okay, so we're going to hold that thought here right now. Now, remember, the first question had only 2 options that students could answer. And I tell them at the beginning of the question, I didn't do this with you all, but I tell them you can only answer yes, over or under, and then we'll have a conversation about it. And we go into the idea of what is a focus group, what kind of questions can you ask, what if you did this in a written survey? Would the answers be the same? Would they be skewed? How do we look at populations or demographics? Those sorts of things. We come at this from a scientific perspective, and I start using that vocabulary with them right at the beginning. The second question on the second day of class is this roll question 2 here, which involves the toothpaste tube. I was going to call it the toilet paper tube, and that's not correct. The toothpaste tube. And in this class, I actually hand over the screen to a student or the whiteboard if we're in a seated classroom. And I say, okay, who wants to be the volunteer and go up and draw an image of what the toothpaste tube looks like? And invariably, they draw a horizontal toothpaste tube. So cap, tail end, this way. And I ask them, okay, in this case, which is the top? And I have another student annotate, where's the top? Where's the middle? Where's the bottom? And we go over the fact that we didn't discuss that prior to the roll. Excuse me, these are operational definitions. What could be variations on this theme? How could it skew your data? So forth and so on. That's a lot of information in a short amount of time, and it's typically the most I ever lecture. But the reason I'm explaining it is this offers students the opportunity to reach back into their comfort zone, something they feel comfortable discussing and they are not challenged too much on, and they can engage with their colleagues. It's preparing us for going forward for the more difficult questions. So I teach neuropsychology, I teach criminal justice, I teach general psychology, I taught general science and math classes. And as we go forward in different areas of the curriculum, we have questions such as, how do you feel about the death penalty? Should marijuana be legalized? When does life begin? So you get the idea that there are some very challenging and fiery topics that we discuss as a class after they have done the reading to come to class and be able to engage intellectually with regard to these role questions. Okay, so if we can close that, I'm going to go on to the next slide and we'll go a little bit further. There we go. So also at the beginning of every class, I offer an agenda. And I relate it to the story of red trucks. And the idea is that you suddenly meet a new person and you think they're really attractive and you want to get to know them better. And you find out that they drive a red truck. And suddenly, everywhere you go, you see red trucks. Like you've never noticed a red truck before in your entire life, but now there's red trucks everywhere. This is kind of like an agenda. We call it priming in psychology and when you're teaching classes on memory. And this means that you are already briefly covering the content, like going over and recognizing everything that's going to be covered in a session or in a module or in a semester. And that way, when you run across them in the future, kind of sparks your memory. So it's an assistance in the learning process. So in this case, I'm not going to read all of these things to you, but if we were in a seated classroom dynamic or having a synchronous class, or even in a fully digital class at the beginning of every module, I introduce the content that is going to be covered, and then I wrap it up at the end. So it's a kind of a three-part harmony that we're doing there. So introduce, cover, and then reflect or wrap it up. And in this case, we have quite a bit that's going to be covered. So I'm going to zoom on to the next. We already covered a little bit of my background in education, so this is not necessary for us. When we're talking about a flipped classroom, typically what I would do is say, what is a flipped classroom? What do you know of this? But it's not going to work in this format. So I want you to take a moment and look over this definition. And obviously there are many. When I ask my students invariably at the beginning of every class, and I say, okay, this is a flipped classroom. How many of you have ever taken a flipped classroom course before? And they'll raise their hands and I say, what does that mean? And they say, that means we teach ourselves. And I laugh because I think, okay, it probably feels like that to the uninitiated. Also, if you're not focusing on the specific criteria to effectively have a flipped classroom, it definitely is going to feel like that. So it is a blended learning process. And what it means basically is that we're setting the typical or common classroom kind of on its ear. We're doing things almost in a reverse. For those of us who are older, you might remember when you took a new class, you were required to read before you came to class, you had conversations in class, and then you went home and you did your homework. So it's a little bit like that in that students need to prepare to come to class. And I reflect back to the original role question when I'm training them on how to do this. I also make sure that they know I do not care about grades. That's not the goal of education. I know grades are important. We're gonna work to achieve having good grades, but that is not the goal of our interaction. It's building relationships. And in that building of relationships, I do not lecture ever. So this is going to feel unusual for me talking for this entire time because I actually try to guide individuals to gathering the information and gathering the content. I do not open up the brain and stuff information in there. We also know that that's not necessarily effective, and we'll talk about that as we go a little bit further. And I kind of guide by this one quote at the bottom here that I have from a colleague that says, if anyone is going to be miserable in my classroom, it's not going to be me. So it's kind of interesting to teach in this format as well because it puts the onus back on the students to take responsibility. And I'm going to stop right there for a second and ask if you have any questions so far, or if any of that jarred your brain with information or challenges that you have working in a flipped classroom format.
And anyone can feel free to input that into the chat or also utilize that Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We have not had any questions come through just yet.
Okay, so I'm going to go on. Let me ask a follow-up question. How many people who are with us, how many of y'all have attempted to teach in a flipped classroom dynamic before? Can you just give us a thumbs up or a smiley face in the chat really quickly so we have an estimate? Or I need to figure out if people are brand spanking new or if you have any kind of a background. Okay, so I see one.
Yep, we got one thumbs up. And we do have 10 live participants right now. So about 3 thumbs up so far.
Okay. Okay, that looks like where we're going to stop right there. And so that's the pregnant pause. That's the waiting for an answer, not trying to jump in and give you all the answer if you were students. So let me ask the 3 that answered, have you had any challenges or successes with this? And if you don't mind just typing in one word or the other.
Both, some challenges, both.
Okay. So when I was interviewed for my most recent full-time faculty position at CCCC, I met the dean, or my academic dean, the night that I began my interview. And his question to me, or his statement was, I've tried to teach in a flipped classroom format and it didn't work. How do you do it? And I said, I'm more stubborn than my students. And sometimes that's what it comes down to. I know this is an effective strategy. The data support it. A great deal of research supports it. And of course, there's research on the other side, I'm sure. But because I believe in it so strongly, I just muscle my way through. And by the end of the term, typically students are with me on this and they enjoy it. And I'm going to share some of the student work that's the result of this format. And you'll see why in just a moment. So this, again, if we were speaking, I would ask you, what am I? And ask for somebody to tell me or put in the chat, what is this diagram? What is this pyramid? And if you can do that, I want to know if anyone's familiar with this. Have you seen this before? Okay. There you go. So I can see that one person answered. 2. I can see the chat. I can see that people are answering. I just can't read it.
Okay, yes, it says that we have about 4 people that answered Bloom's taxonomy.
Okay, good. The difference here is that this is an inverted version of Bloom's taxonomy. So you're correct, it is. The difference is that this is a Bloom's taxonomy for a flipped classroom format. So if you look at the original, and I should have them side by side, but again, this is a different format for me. If you look at the original, you'll see that the base of everything is to remember. So it's the basics, definitions, algorithms, equations, things that you memorize that Einstein said, I can just look that up. I don't need to memorize that. So what we want to try to do is get students to the highest position, which is creating, envisioning, and applying material towards new ends. In the seated classroom, that's difficult if we're spending all of our time working with the basics. So the idea in a flipped classroom is that you spend the time at home working on the basics, the memorizing and the plugging and chugging of equations and what have you, so that when you come to class, we are really creating and developing and engaging with each other to take our knowledge base a little further. And it comes from this concept. I'm going to give you a second to look at it. And I can't see you, so I don't know if anybody else is nodding their head and saying, yes, I can agree with this. But the first time I read this, I thought it was hilarious. And that is because this is the way so many people are taught, and so many people have, trying to learn, and it's nearly impossible. I know that I feel this way in a math class, typically, even though I have a minor in math. And that's because so many instructors in class, they say, here's how you do it. Here's the equation. I understand it perfectly in class, and I go home and the homework is nothing like what it was in class. And the exams are even taking that thought process to another level. So we're being tested and testing our students on material that they've not had time to get their hands in because it doesn't come naturally to them. We have to kind of train them how to get your hands in, how to work with it and get muddy. And that's what we do in the class here. So where is this applicable? It's 3 different areas. Actually, it's applicable anywhere. You can do this in a webinar, which is what I would typically do with y'all, but it's applicable in the seated classroom, blended learning classrooms where you have part-time they're seated and the other time they are in a synchronous atmosphere, whether it's in person or digitally. It's also, believe it or not, applicable in fully distance or digital learning. You just have to focus on the basic format for a flipped classroom, what the pillars are and what everybody's responsibilities are. And you have to make that very clear to them, okay? So the 4 pillars of the flipped classroom are to have a flexible environment. Case in point, sometimes it doesn't work the way we want to. Sometimes the smart board doesn't turn on. I've had that happen during observations, formal observations. You have to have a learning culture. That means they are willing to learn and you are willing to learn. I learn more each semester from my students than they could ever learn from me because there's 24 or 25 of them in a class with many more ideas and experiences than I have to myself. So I'm constantly pushing them onto each other. I'm constantly encouraging them to engage with their colleagues in the classroom and in their discussion boards. And again, it's not a normal response. It has to be modeled, and we have to work on the parameters and the boundaries for this. There has to be intentional content, excuse me. This doesn't mean that there's not flexibility in the classroom. It just means that there's a goal within that flexibility. When I began teaching, it was heavily emphasized to us in my school system, and I feel I was very fortunate to begin in that school system. We are not teaching subject matter, we are teaching humans. So I may lay out the best lesson plans and have done this, things that I get chills just thinking about it, like this is going to be so awesome. And then I get to class and I realize this particular group of students doesn't have the scaffolding. They cannot do this where it is. Or we get in class and my exciting lesson plan turns into their exciting ideas, which turn out to be better than my lesson plan. So I need to be able to pivot and adjust to that. Doesn't mean the content is not intentional. It just means that it's adjustable, going back to the flexible environment idea. Also, it helps to have a professional educator. One of the things that I recently learned and have somewhat known is that the majority of psychology instructors in high school and even some early college courses are not psychologists. They don't have a degree in psychology. They may have a degree in some of the social sciences, but that doesn't mean that they are specifically educated to attend to the wide range of questions that are going to come up about psychology in a psychology classroom. And this goes to any subject matter. And we all know this. We know that people have been moved from teaching history to public health to math, just based on what is the need of the institution at the time and the class enrollment. So having a professional educator is important. Also having someone who is educated specifically in that domain so that they can have more flexibility in their classroom. Okay, so everybody has their responsibilities. I'm going to let you look at this rather than read it to you, just in the interest of time and what I want us to be able to get to. So the instructor and the facilitator has their responsibilities for us to be able to learn, and the students have their responsibilities for them to be able to learn and for us to be able to learn. And we talk about this very briefly at the beginning of the course, and then we talk about it as we go on through the course when I feel like I have missed a step in my responsibilities or they have missed a step in their responsibilities. The ability for the class to be interesting and effective relies upon everybody doing their job and holding true to their role. So the basic format for the flipped classroom looks something like this. Before class, students prepare. This can be, and I've had people tell me before, this has to be a lecture. It has to be a lecture or a video of some sort. It doesn't. It can be text that people need to read. It can be videos that they need to find, videos they need to watch. It can be a video of you lecturing if you prefer to do that. I just don't. But there needs to be some prior to class preparation, and there needs to be a goal involved with that preparation. Why are the students having this assignment? What are they doing? Some classes like to have people submit work prior to class for the instructor to review and discuss during class. That's also a possibility. During class is where you're going to use the bulk of your activity, whether it's creating projects or having debates or whatever is going on. The heaviest emphasis is here because this is where the students are really grasping the information, they're growing, they're challenging each other and themselves. And then after class, they need to have a reflective portion. So they need to look at an additional article. They need to create something. They need to engage in a discussion board. Discussion boards are typically my go-tos, and I'll explain why in just a moment. So this is the basic format. Again, before class, during class, and after class activities. And they need to be divided up as such. And your ideas for this will change as you go along. Okay, so some examples of pre-work, before class activities. In the chat, just as quickly as you can, give me an idea of some things that you would have students do prior to the beginning of a flipped class for any module, any particular content that you're covering. What are some things that students could do before class to prepare for class?
One person said watch a YouTube video.
Okay, good.
I'm thinking maybe have the class read an article or something along those lines.
Good.
We do have one person that said take a personality test for a psychology class.
Yeah.
View voiced over PowerPoints.
Very good. Okay, good. So that's some really good content. Read a textbook, view a video, find a video. Somebody else said something. Is that a new one?
Yes, go over handouts. And then also read text, watch my video, watch other videos, and then interactive Desmos assignments.
Okay, very good. So y'all have the idea there. These are these things that are preparatory to kind of prime the brain, get students thinking about the concept. And then we have our in-class time. Now, I still follow a basic format that I was trained, again, as a novice math and science teacher back in 1998. And this is essential questions linked to prior knowledge, review that material, the content of the class session, and then close at the end, wrap everything up or debrief or whatever you want to call it. So despite whatever the content is of my classwork time, we still do link to prior knowledge. We still do address the essential questions. So they know what is the goal of that class session, and also they're not starting cold. With some of my classes, I can just tell students, okay, when you come in, I need you to review your notes or whatever you've done from the previous session or what you did outside of class. With other classes, I find that I need to physically help them wake back up or rewind the movie 15 seconds rather than just starting from cold, okay? What are some examples then of things that you can do in class that you think would be interesting, informative, educational, and applicable? Okay, let me remove all the qualifiers. What are some things that you think you could do during in-class or in-class activities? Okay.
We had one that said compare, contrast a topic.
Okay, very good.
Case study.
Okay, we're going to.
You're cutting out a little bit. Are you there, Professor Barker? Okay, it might just be on my end, but you are back. But we did have a few more come in. So we had project-based activity and learning, create test questions, and then also working groups to find multiple ways to solve an equation.
Very good. So I don't know why I'm cutting out, and I do apologize, but this is how it goes as well with life. So these are some really good ideas for in-class activities. One of the things that we're trying to do here is to focus on the cool stuff. Don't spend your time in class with the boring, dull, mediocre, or you're going to put them to sleep, we're going to lecture, we're going to watch a movie. Let them get up and get active. I do things with my students. We do popcorn, we do drills, we have debates, we have, I send them out into the population and have them run science experiments with other classes. Now I get advanced, approval from people to do that, but I make it as active and engaging as possible, so that, and it's a skill with working with small children as well, so that those students who did not prepare, not that we call them out, not that they're ostracized, but they go, oh, look how much fun it is to do these things, and I have no idea what they're doing because I didn't read. Okay. So you want to make it interesting. You want to make it applicable. Some instructors use this time to do group work and then turn in the assignments. I do that to an extent with my students, but I give a caveat. If we have a group work assignment, each person is responsible for submitting on their own. That way they can add to or detract from, so that you don't hear, I did all the work. Or at least you don't hear it as much. I did all the work, nobody else helped me, or I didn't like this, or whatever. But again, in time in the classroom, I'm not using it for instructional time. I'm using it for collaborative time with the students working together to do something, whether it's a debate or a development of something. And then post work, after class reflection. So at the end of class, I've kind of wrapped it up. I ask them to summarize. If they're note takers, I don't have them take notes, but if they're note takers, please summarize. And then after class, they have a reflection activity, and it is due typically the same day every week. That's just the way I function. What are some things that you could have your students do to reflect back on the material that you've covered in class? Okay, so that's the part that we're going to talk about a little bit. We're going to focus on. All right, very good. Thank you for helping me get through and understand what your background and your level of training and comfort is with this. And we're going to move on to some other things. So, pre-work, as you guys have mentioned, textbook material, assigned articles, videos on YouTube or wherever, teacher developed videos, so forth and so on. I'm going to show you an example at the end that I had a student who is very creative and very tech savvy years ago when Quizlet just first came out, and had done the pre-work and the reading and said she learns best through flashcards and things of that nature. So she created Quizlet, shared it preemptively in the coffee house, the student coffee house discussion forum that I set up for all my classes, and then agreed to share it amongst different classes. So the other classes then responded by sending videos to these classes. And so I had multiple classes interacting with each other, sharing content and information, and it was no longer my responsibility, which is cool on multiple levels, but also kind of an amazing thing to see happen. Some examples of classwork. You may recognize some of these terms. I'm going to let you look at them while I'm discussing them with you. Jigsaw works really well if you have students that can compartmentalize information and then piece it together. It's a challenge if you don't, and this takes getting to know your students. Debate, we know what those are. Treasure hunts, I use continually, and I use them very often when the students stump me. When they ask a question in class and I can't answer it, I go, I don't know, what do you think? Let's look it up, see what we find. And that is because I don't know everything. I'm not meant to know everything. I do my best to field questions, but my students like to tease me and say to new students arriving or new students at a different level of the class, they'll ask a question, say, Dr. Barker, I have a question, and I'll say, I have an answer. And someone else will say, no, she doesn't. She's going to ask you another question. And this is true. I very rarely answer questions directly, but I will lead them to where the questions are, or I turn it around and ask what the class thinks. And if everybody is stumped, we have a treasure hunt immediately. Experiments, you can do facilitator-led experiments. I don't really care for those. We can do student developed experiments. Sometimes I provide an example. I don't explain it at all. And then I tell them to play with it and see what they've learned. And they write about what they've learned from this experiment. Here are a couple examples. Studying the senses. There's one with termites. It's really cool, but we won't go into that detail right now. And some of my favorites are teach the class, popcorn, and stations. So what we're going to talk about in a moment, or you're going to see in a moment, is some examples of teach the class. And then finally, examples of reflection activities. So as I mentioned, I heavily emphasize discussion boards. And then I give very specific rules and regulations for the discussion boards. One is you are welcome to post your opinion because I'm asking you your opinion, but you must substantiate your opinion in fact. And you can't say prior knowledge, and you can't say that's the way, we always did it. A convention is not going to work here. I need you to tell me where you got that information. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong, and I will never tell a student this is right or wrong, especially in a group conversation. I'll address them in their grade book, or we'll have a conversation differently. This is because we have learned over the years that science is continually changing. And what I think is right today may not be right tomorrow. There are some things that are settled, and there are some things that are not. And if we continually tell students that their perception of something is incorrect, then we kind of defeat the ability to grow for our students and also as a community and as a culture. Journaling and writing assignments, self-explanatory. Okay, teach your dog or your sister or your mother or your brother or whomever. This is when I send them home and I say, okay, your reflection for tonight is to give me a signed document from your mom saying she now understands the structure of a neuron. Okay. And the student could fake it for sure, but it's a different way to do a dull, boring, monotonous reflection activity, and there are variations on that theme. Some of the other examples will be create an experiment, write it up, test it, share your data with the class when you return tomorrow. And these things can happen actually very quickly. We can come up with an experiment on the fly, and I prove that to them in class as well. Another is create a learning tool, a quiz, a Quizlet, a PowerPoint, something like that, after class. And then student develop questions, quizzes, or games. And then I cannibalize those and take them for myself because I'm not creative, as you can tell from this PowerPoint. So in class, or I'm sorry, during classroom activities, sometimes I will assign a group of students to share or teach the class about one particular objective. I typically don't make it larger than an objective because taking on a whole chapter is a challenge, especially when you've got a group of students who may or may not work well together. And we choose the group by, counting off by 4s or 5s or 2s, or who's the tallest and who's the shortest, whatever. I don't ability group, and this is for a number of reasons. Also because I want students to constantly work with different people and realize that it's okay, and that we build comfort by doing this. And some of their discussion board posts include those instructions that they must respond to a different person based on a certain set of criteria. Somebody who posted about a different objective, so forth and so on. So we're going to talk about really quickly, because we can't really engage as effectively in this format, some of the pros and cons that we have expressed before, that we've covered before in previous sessions. As you can see, some of the pros of this type of learning is it encourages student responsibility, it encourages critical thinking, it encourages flexibility. Some of the cons are training. Not all instructors feel comfortable in working in this format. Not all students are comfortable in engaging in this format. And so what we do is reward by approximation. The closer they get to doing what it is I'm trying to get them to do, the more activities we get to do, and the cooler the class itself is. And again, down to what if they don't engage? You just got to be more stubborn than your students. We'll win them out. Okay, so examples of student pre-work. This is very small and difficult for you to see, but this is actually a coffee house forum. So I set these up in their discussion board forums. And at the top it says coffee house. This is where you challenge each other and communicate. And I continually say, I speak to them about their colleagues, not their peers, because that has a different meaning. I speak to them about their colleagues, and I tell them constantly, you have 24 colleagues in this class. Make sure you would check with your colleagues. What are your colleagues saying about your work? Because this is very important for peer review and analysis as they go through their education, and further, especially in the science-based courses. But I do speak to them in that fashion, so they are already of an elevated mindset, and this is for all grades, all dynamics, all populations. They're already in an elevated mindset, thinking of themselves as scientists, educators, colleagues, as opposed to young students and children in many situations when we're working with the high school students especially. So this is actually an example of a discussion board shared by some high school students. They've all given me permission to use their work. In fact, they would prefer to be here with me telling you what they get to do in class, because they seem to enjoy it. This is a treasure hunt that goes along with the developmental psychology chapter in the general psychology book. And the reason I do this way is there are a number of reasons why I do it this way. One is it's a challenging chapter to work with students. It has some very controversial topics. It has some very uncomfortable topics for students. And everybody has an opinion on this, and everybody is very strongly engaged in their opinion on this. And so we need to cover the content, but we need to do it without necessarily sharing our personal opinions or attacking somebody else for their personal opinions. And so what I do with this chapter is I make it as complicated as possible, and I give them what I call a treasure hunt. And it comes in 3 parts. And the first part is to determine what the objectives are for this chapter. The second is to determine where your name falls on the roster. And the third is to determine whose name falls below you on the roster. And the instructions say you need to find your objective based upon where your name is on the roster. You need to post that objective in the subject line, and then answer that objective, develop it, teach us about that objective. And then you need to respond to the person whose name falls directly below you in the roster. And I'm laughing because it's funny how differently different classes will handle this. I have some classes where the students absolutely do not do a thing until the night it's due, and then suddenly everybody turns in their work. I have classes where that occurs and nobody turns in their work, and then we have a different conversation. I have classes such as this one that I'm sharing with you right now, that the day it came due, or the day it was opened, they immediately said, we're not dealing with this nonsense. I don't want to have to figure out where the roster is. Somebody took charge, determined where the roster was, determined what the objectives were, assigned their objectives to each student by name and who they needed to respond to. And you'll see the content. They were having this whole conversation in the student coffee house. I didn't tell them to do this. They just did this on their own, and jumped right in with all feet and knowledge and engagement, and enjoyed the activity. It is true that it doesn't work for everyone, and some students are a little bit shut down about this, and they don't feel that they have the skill set to do it. So I actually have a third discussion board that goes with this, and it is the opportunity to earn a discussion board grade. And the instructions say that what they have to do is they need to explain, why did I assign this? Why did I assign it this way? Why did I assign it where it landed in our semester? And in our semester, it is in the developmental stages for general psychology. It's in different places for other classes, because it's directly after we've learned about the brain, learning, problem solving, so forth and so on, and directly before we talk about personality and disorders and social psychology. So it fits very well in there, and it creates an interesting work dynamic. Here's the example from the student that I mentioned that said, hey, I learned best through using flashcards. Can I create a Quizlet for the class? And I said, absolutely. May I please have that Quizlet? Here's an example where a couple students wanted to just further express and share with their colleagues how to make the best use of some of the materials in class. One of them is called a book walk, and this is the one that's on the left. I'm not going to open this one. I don't have the link to it here. And they just chose a random chapter in an abnormal, no, I think that's general psychology course, and worked with their students on how you do a book walk. What does that look like? How do we use our textbook to best serve us? This over to the right is where one of my students decided to assist their younger colleagues with how to utilize the word processor for creating APA citations and references. And that is for the students that didn't want to raise their hand and ask in class, or weren't able to attend the seminars on APA, so forth and so on. There we go. So in that particular PowerPoint, you can see that this student is much more competent than I am in creating PowerPoints. He circled things, he drew arrows, how to insert citations, so forth and so on. And he basically just walked his classmates. Now, in the future classes, he actually came back to speak to each of my classes and tell his colleagues, how to do these things, his colleagues that weren't in his class anymore. Here's an example of an agenda, like I said, that I supply for them prior to every single class meeting that we have, or the beginning of every new module, not in the agenda format for the modules, but in the objectives and content. And here is an in-class teach the class activity that students created. As you can see, these are different students from different classes, but it's similar to a jigsaw activity where each group of students had one objective that they had to teach the class. And fortunately, again, for their classmates, they are much better at this than I am. I'm going to see if I can get this to go through. So you can see that in this case, this was explaining about classical conditioning. I don't know if it'll show any of the animation here. And then operant conditioning, the difference between the two. These are all active videos. And then any questions. So not very long, not very complicated, but it did answer all the questions, and it did provide the opportunity to teach their colleagues in a much more interesting way than I could. Let's see if we can see this one. These guys actually used some video outtakes that are hilarious to me. So talking about reactions to different types of stimuli. And oops, let's see if I can get it to go. And in this case, I'm not going to drag you through this episode, but if you have not watched The Office, there are a number of exquisite episodes covering the differences between classical and operant conditioning in psychology. They also, see if I can, I think it's going to play. Nope. I'm trying to keep it from playing. They also, it ended. I'm sorry. They also went so far as to have some additional videos taken from Big Bang Theory and other things that their colleagues could relate to. And this was so wonderful because it's not something that I could have done, not the way that my brain works. And these guys did it on the fly in class. They had 15 minutes to meet. They had that time to lay out their plan, and then they came back in the next session and presented. And they only had the parameters of how long should it last, how many slides could you have, you must have references in APA format, so forth and so on. And so I'm going to see if I can get this to go to the next screen without closing it again. Okay, and then finally, the reflection activities. Again, these are very small here for you all to see, but I think that Hawks makes the PowerPoints available. And you can see that in their discussion boards, and this takes training and it takes time, you can see that they learn how to copy and paste the prompt, and then to answer each question one at a time. This is why you copy and paste the prompt, so that you ensure you don't leave out any portion of the question. Each answer only has to be a couple sentences long, but you'll find that they start writing a lot because they really get into the material. But they need to support their position, again, with the citations and the references. So I'm teaching them APA, I'm teaching science at the same time, and they are actually working with and challenging their colleagues about the material that they read in the chapter or any outside materials. And that's pretty much the end of the presentation as far as it goes, just trying to share student work with you all. Now, questions. What are some challenges that you've found specifically? What are some modules that you think you would like to flip but don't know how to flip? I'd like us to be able to take a little time to discuss those ideas. If you could put them in the chat or the question and answer or anything actually that comes to mind. I know I speak quickly and we went through that very quickly, but I was just trying to keep to the time that we had here.
We did have a chat come through where they asked for you to explain popcorn and Jigsaw.
Okay, good. So popcorn is it's an old reading strategy. My mother was a reading specialist, so we take from everywhere that we can. And what that is, it's kind of like Around the World, which is another thing that we did in classes when we were growing up. And you do this in a number of fashions. You can do this with reading the text if you have a group of students that you feel are not reading, or the text is too challenging for them to read, or you want them to read through an article together. And so the first student either volunteers or gets drafted, and they read a particular section, and then they popcorn the next student. Okay, so Kim reads, and then I popcorn Hawk's learning, or I popcorn the next person that's next to me. That's the basic version. The popcorn on crack version is they come to class with questions that they've designed to try to stump their classmates. And if they stump me, then they get extra credit points. And if they stump their classmate, what they do, and that you will see that they always pick on their best friends or their boyfriend or girlfriend, and they will say, popcorn Alicia, and then they ask the absolute most difficult, obtuse question in the entire chapter to try to stump them. And if they do, then they get an extra credit point and they get to go on to the next question. And if they don't, then that person gets the extra credit point and they get to popcorn somebody else. So it just means ensuring that the conversation is going in multiple directions in the classroom, which was a buzzword years ago, and I adhere to this, trying to get everybody involved. And then Jigsaw is when you assign, whether it's a chapter or a book or an article, and you assign different roles and different sections to different people, and their purpose is to complete their assignment well and put it all together, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. It's one of the applications that people use sometimes with group work to ensure that everybody does their fair share, and you kind of assign the roles and obligations based upon the students and what you know about them at that time. I use it very, very loosely in the classrooms, again, because of my decision not to ability group students, or not to try to pigeonhole them into what I think they can or cannot do. I try to treat everybody kind of the same way and ensure that everybody has the opportunity to perform. And I use a lot more carrot than I do stick. And this again is where I go back to the whole relationship building. Grades are not what's important to me. Challenging themselves, growing as an individual and as a learner, that's what's important in this environment. I hope I answered that question. I kind of went around it a little bit. Anything else?
Yes, we did have one comment come in that they said, I want to flip my statistics class, but I'm worried my students won't prepare ahead of time.
Oh, they won't. Yeah, so you are correct. You can worry that way. They won't until they learn how to. So you have to model the behavior for them. And again, starting with some sort of innocuous role question, and then pointing out to them, see, you prepared for this class. You knew which way the toilet paper roll went, and you were prepared to answer that question, and then even further develop the question. So, for classes like statistics, you could say, read up on read up on the marijuana laws. I mean, choose something that is going to intrigue them and captivate them, so that they can come to class knowing something about the background without knowing everything about the background, and feeling completely free to fail, fall on their faces, say, I don't know. And then we have an impromptu treasure hunt. So at the beginning, they will not prepare, and you'll be dragging them through. But once they realize it's much more fun when they prepare, then you'll find that they will join in, even if it's a handful of students at a time. And then the others see that the handful of students are getting to have these cool conversations and debates about the statistics of this or the statistics of that. I actually taught statistics almost 30 years ago, and I would tell my students every year at the beginning, I'm teaching this from a reading and English perspective. And I wound up with an overload standing room in my classroom at this high school, because they didn't have to memorize formulas. What they did was they came to class to understand the formulas. They came to class to discuss, statistics, lies, and damn statistics, that you can manipulate data in any way depending on what you're looking to show. We talked about biases and things like that. And I got off track again, but that would be the best way to do it. Another way to start, especially for a class like statistics or another analytical course, is to send them home with a specific document. The first time you try to flip, and I would try to flip a module first, send them home with a specific document or a specific video, and ask them to annotate 5 things you found interesting in that video. And then they come to class the next day, or 5 things you learned from that video, or 5 things you learned from that document. They come to class the next day, put them in small groups, let them discuss what each other found interesting, or 5 things that you thought didn't make any sense. You get the idea. So that they're starting small with being prepared for class, and they're only responsible for these 5 things. That's all they have to come with, or 2 things, whatever. But if they're in a statistics class, it's probably going to be a little bit more in depth that you can go with them. I hope I answered that, gave you some ideas anyways.
Absolutely. And that is it for questions so far. So if anyone has any other questions, comments, please feel free to input that in the chat. And that instructor that had the statistics comment and question, she said that yes, that did help, and thank you.
Good, absolutely. So you'll see at the end of the presentation, if the PowerPoint is shared, I tried to provide a number of resources, and in the other PowerPoint as well, that show the application in medical classes, in statistics classes, in ESL classes. The very first time I gave this presentation, somebody asked me, how would we do this in an ESL class? And my mind went blank, despite the fact that I'm teaching on this, because I've never taught ESL, so I couldn't relate to it. And as soon as the presentation was over, I was like, of course, they can do the vocabulary at home. They can come in and write a story. But just in the moment, I was like, I don't know what you would do in that situation. So we all get stumped, sometimes as we're trying to work through and grapple with new things and how to share new ideas. Again, I would send you back to your colleagues, like I do with my students, to have conversations. I'm also available. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I like working with instructors on how to do this, because it's a little intimidating at the beginning, and then you learn how cool it is.
And we do have just a few more minutes. I saw a few other things came into the chat. We did have one question that said, have you used these tactics with developmental students?
I have, actually. So in a number of my classes, I have a wide range of students, obviously. And what I have found is that students who have a 504 or some sort of other plan, or an IPP, depending on whether you're talking about high school or college or what have you, very often work harder than just about anybody else. And it's kind of a neat thing, because it's out of the norm for the way classes are taught. And so students who learn differently, for whatever reason, who have a learning disability, or who have other types of diagnoses, are often intrigued by this, because it's the opportunity that they have to grow and excel and kind of show off a little bit their special gifts that they do. I actually had one student, and I'll share this because she would be happy with sharing it, and again would be happy to sit right here with me and tell this story. She was the cashier at, I guess it was a food line. It was some restaurant, grocery store chain. And for their personal research project on social psychology, she wanted to evaluate the response of individuals to people with autism. And we had all sorts of conversations about informed consent and what can happen and what cannot happen. And she actually had a confidant, so a collaborator that worked with her to record individuals' interactions, interpersonal reactions with her at the register, with a button on that said, I have autism, and when she didn't have the button on. And it's not necessarily an answer to your question, as much to say, my students that have had a wide range of diagnoses have typically come out swinging, to have the opportunity to do things in an interesting fashion and kind of show off their skill sets. So.
Perfect. And then we just had a couple other comments. One instructor said that they'd love to see another presentation with you, so consider a follow-up to this one. A few people just said thank you, great information and presentation. And it looks like we are just about out of time here as well. So thank you all so much for attending today, and thank you, Dr. Barker, for taking the time for this wonderful presentation. If any of you attending or your fellow instructors are interested in presenting in our Learning and Growing webinar series, please submit your proposals to our website, and I'm going to link that into the chat. And then we'll also be emailing everyone a recording of this presentation as well to go back and take a look. But Professor Barker, did you have anything else to add?
I did one thing that came to mind in reference to the developmentally delayed or the challenged student. And this instructor is probably familiar with the movie, but I love it, and I find it. Gosh, I can't even word find, but Temple Grandin. If you have the opportunity to watch that, it's just a fantastic story, and it's about reaching people and letting them to learn outside of their box. And mm, it's a great movie if you have the opportunity. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it. I enjoyed being here.
Yes, well, thank you so much for presenting today. And there are numerous people in the chat saying thank you as well. So I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing everyone in our future learning and growing webinars.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.